I turned 81 the morning my daughter-in-law told me to crawl, and the strange thing wasn't what she did, it was how little it surprised me. The room smelled faintly of vanilla frosting and fresh-cut lilies, a careful attempt at celebration that felt more like a stage set than a home. My birthday cake sat at the center of the dining table, its white icing too perfect, untouched, as if no one had intended for it to be eaten at all. I stood near the end of the table, one hand resting lightly on my cane, the other curled against the fabric of my navy dress, listening to the low hum of conversation that seemed to move around me rather than include me. Lauren had organized everything. Of course she had. She always did. Every chair placed just so, every plate aligned, every detail controlled with that quiet precision she wore like perfume. Daniel hovered near her, nodding at things I couldn't hear, his voice soft, agreeable, distant. He hadn't looked at me once since I arrived. Not really. Not the way he used to, years ago, when his eyes would light up like I was the center of his world. Now, I was something else. Something smaller. Something to be managed. I noticed it in the way the conversations shifted when I stepped closer, in the way laughter softened into polite silence. Even the grandchildren, sweet as they were, had been gently steered away from me with distractions and whispered instructions. I told myself I was imagining it. That at 81, perhaps I was simply more sensitive to the spaces between people. But then Lauren's voice cut through the room, smooth and bright, asking if everyone had what they needed, if everything looked perfect, if this was exactly the kind of celebration I deserved. Deserved. The word lingered longer than it should have. I remember looking down at my cane then, the polished wood worn smooth beneath my fingers, a quiet companion I had come to rely on more than I ever wanted to admit. It wasn't weakness, I had told myself. Just balance. Just support. Just time catching up in its own gentle way. When Lauren approached me, her smile was the same one she wore for guests, wide and effortless, but her eyes were different, calculating, measuring. She stopped just a step too close, close enough that I could see the reflection of the overhead lights in her pupils, sharp and cold. You shouldn't depend on that so much, she said lightly, her voice carrying just enough for the room to hear without seeming like she meant it to. I felt the shift before I saw it. Conversation slowing, attention turning, a subtle tightening in the air. I didn't respond. I simply watched her, the way one watches a storm rolling in from a distance, knowing there is nothing to be done but wait. And then, with a casual flick of her hand, she knocked the cane from my grasp. It hit the floor with a soft, hollow sound that seemed louder than it should have been, echoing in the sudden quiet. For a moment, no one moved. Not Daniel. Not the guests. Not even me. Lauren tilted her head slightly, still smiling, as if this were all part of some harmless joke no one else quite understood yet. If you want it, she said, her tone gentle, almost kind, you can get it yourself. My eyes followed the cane where it lay on the polished hardwood, just out of reach. I felt every gaze in the room settle on me, waiting, measuring, deciding. And slowly, very slowly, I bent my knees, lowering myself toward the floor, not to reach for the cane, but to make them believe I would. I let my body lower just enough for them to believe the moment was real, just enough for the silence in the room to thicken into something almost tangible, and I could feel it then, the weight of every pair of eyes pressing down on me, measuring how far I would go, how small I would allow myself to become, and for a brief second I remembered a different room, a different version of myself, standing tall in a kitchen that smelled of Sunday roast and fresh coffee, where laughter came easily and no one questioned my place at the table, where Daniel would reach for my hand without thinking and Lauren had not yet learned how to rearrange a room without moving a single piece of furniture, and I wondered, not for the first time, exactly when that shift had happened, when the quiet adjustments began, when the invitations became suggestions, and the suggestions became decisions made without me, but I did not stay in that thought for long because the present demanded my attention, and the hardwood floor beneath me was cool and smooth as I steadied myself, my fingers hovering just above it, not quite touching, not quite reaching, and I could hear someone clear their throat across the room, an awkward sound that tried and failed to break the tension, while Lauren remained perfectly still, watching me with that same composed expression, as if she had all the time in the world to see how this would play out, as if this was not cruelty, but a simple test of reality, And perhaps to her it was. Perhaps she believed that this was practical, necessary, even justified, because over the past 2 years she had introduced that word into nearly every conversation about me. Practical, as in it is more practical if Margaret does not live alone. It is more practical if we manage her finances. It is more practical if we think ahead before something happens. And Daniel had nodded each time, slow at first, hesitant, but eventually with a rhythm that felt rehearsed, and I had listened, always from just outside the center of the conversation, always treated as though I were both present and not entirely included. And that was how it began, not with a single cruel act, but with a series of small decisions that quietly moved me further and further away from my own life, until even my birthday felt like an event I had been invited to rather than something that belonged to me. And as I remained there, suspended, between standing and kneeling, I realized that what they were waiting for was not simply for me to pick up the cane. They were waiting for confirmation that I would accept the version of myself they had already decided upon, fragile, dependent, manageable. And I almost smiled at the thought, because just 24 hours earlier I had been sitting at my small kitchen table, the morning light filtering through the curtains in that familiar way, when the phone rang and a voice I had not heard in years introduced himself as Thomas Green, the attorney who had once helped my late husband organize our affairs, and his tone had been careful, respectful, but underneath it there was something else, something urgent, and he had asked if we could meet, said there were documents I needed to review. Changes that had been filed recently that did not align with the original arrangements. And I remember the way my hand tightened around the receiver then, not out of fear, but recognition, because suddenly the past 2 years made a different kind of sense. The careful questions about signatures, the subtle pressure to update things, the casual mentions of convenience. And as I listened to him explain, just enough to make it clear that something had been set in motion without my full understanding, I felt that same quiet shift inside me that I feel now, here on the floor, not panic, not anger, but clarity. And as the silence in the dining room stretched another second too long, I lifted my gaze from the cane to Lauren, meeting her eyes fully for the first time that evening. And I did not reach forward. I did not rush. I simply held that moment, letting it settle, letting them wonder. Because for the first time in a very long while, I was not the one being measured, they were. I straightened before my hand ever touched the floor, not quickly, not dramatically, just enough to break the expectation that had settled over the room like dust. And I saw it then, the flicker of confusion that passed across Lauren's face, subtle but undeniable, because she had already written the ending to this moment in her mind, and I had just stepped outside of it. And for a second no one spoke, not even Daniel, who stood a few feet away with his hands loosely at his sides, as if he were unsure whether he was supposed to intervene or simply observe. And I realized that this silence was familiar too, not new, just louder now. The same silence that had followed so many small moments over the past 2 years when something did not quite feel right, but no one named it. No one questioned it. They simply let it pass, smoothing it over with polite smiles and changed subjects. And that was how it had worked. How everything had shifted without confrontation, without a single clear line being crossed, until suddenly there I was, standing in my own home feeling like a guest who had overstayed her welcome. And I thought back to the afternoon before, sitting across from Thomas Green in his office, the air cool and still, the faint scent of paper and polished wood surrounding us, as he slid a folder across the desk with careful hands and explained that certain documents had been updated, authorizations adjusted, signatures obtained, all appearing proper at a glance, but carrying a pattern that suggested influence rather than intention. And I remember how I listened without interrupting, how I let him finish every sentence, every explanation, because something inside me had already settled into place, not shock, not even disappointment, but recognition, as if I had finally been given the missing piece to a puzzle I had been assembling without knowing it. And when he asked if I had knowingly approved those changes, I had simply met his eyes and said no. And that single word had felt heavier than anything I had said in years. And now, back in the dining room, I let that same calm settle over me again as I looked from Lauren to Daniel, taking in the distance in his posture, the way he avoided my gaze, and I realized that whatever hesitation he once had was long gone, replaced by something quieter and far more dangerous, acceptance. And I wondered if he even saw this moment the way it was, or if to him it was just another necessary step in a plan that had been unfolding piece by piece. And the thought did not sting the way it might have once. It simply clarified things, made the edges sharper, easier to see. And I bent slightly at the waist, reaching not toward the cane but toward the table, steadying myself with the back of a chair before rising fully again, my movements slow but deliberate, controlled, and I heard a soft murmur ripple through the room. Confusion replacing anticipation, because this was not how it was supposed to go, not the script they had written, and I could feel Lauren watching me closely now, her expression tightening just enough to betray that something had shifted beyond her control. And for the first time that evening, I allowed myself a small smile. Not wide, not performative, just a quiet acknowledgement of what I now understood, that this moment was never about the cane. It was about permission, about seeing whether I would accept the role they had prepared for me. And as I met her gaze again, steady and unhurried, I realized that I had already made my decision the moment I walked into that lawyer's office. I just had not said it out loud yet, and perhaps I did not need to. Not here, not now, because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to follow the path laid out for you, and simply stand where you are, letting everyone else adjust to you instead. The room did not recover immediately, and that was the first real sign that something had broken, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that could not be smoothed over with polite laughter or a change of subject, because now everyone was watching, not just out of curiosity, but with a quiet awareness that something had shifted beyond their understanding. And I could see it in the way a woman near the window lowered her glass slightly, in the way one of the grandchildren stopped mid-step as if unsure whether to continue across the room, and even in the way Daniel finally looked at me, truly looked at me, his eyes searching for something familiar and not quite finding it. And I wondered if this was the first time he had realized that I was not as easily moved as he had come to believe, not as predictable, not as willing to follow the gentle direction of someone else's plan. And Lauren, for all her composure, adjusted her posture ever so slightly, her shoulders tightening, her smile holding but no longer effortless. And she took a small step forward as if to reclaim control of the moment, as if to guide it back to where she had intended it to go. But there are moments in life that do not return once they have shifted, and this was one of them. And I let the silence stretch just a second longer before I reached down, not hurriedly, not submissively, but with deliberate calm, and picked up my cane, my fingers closing around it with the same familiarity I had carried for years, and I straightened again, fully this time, standing tall in a way that had nothing to do with strength in my legs, and everything to do with something else entirely, something steadier, something that had been quietly rebuilding itself long before this evening. And I rested the cane lightly beside me, not leaning on it, not needing it in that moment. And when I finally spoke, my voice was even, unraised, but it carried across the room with a clarity that made every word land exactly where it needed to. "Thank you, Lauren," I said, and the words caused a ripple of confusion because they did not match the moment anyone had expected, not gratitude, not calm acknowledgement. But I continued before anyone could interrupt. "It is good to know where I stand." And I saw it then, the first real crack in her certainty, because she understood that this was not compliance, not forgiveness, but recognition, and recognition is far more dangerous than anger, because it does not fade. It settles, it sharpens, it waits. And Daniel shifted beside her, his expression tightening as if he sensed that something had moved beyond his control as well. And I thought again of the documents in Thomas Green's office, the neat signatures, the dates that aligned just a little too conveniently, the language that sounded helpful but carried consequences buried beneath its surface. And I realized that what they had been building was not just a plan for my future, but a quiet erasure of my present, a way to move me gently out of the center of my own life without ever needing to say it directly. And perhaps they believed that I would not notice, or that if I did, I would accept it the way I had accepted so many small changes before. But there is a difference between patience and surrender, and I had mistaken one for the other for far too long. And as I looked around the room once more, taking in the careful decorations, the untouched cake, the guests who no longer knew where to direct their attention, I felt something settle inside me with absolute certainty, not anger, not even sadness, but decision, and it was quiet, almost invisible, but it was there, solid and unmoving. And I knew then that whatever came next would not follow the path that had been prepared for me, because that path no longer existed, not in the way they had imagined. And as Lauren opened her mouth as if to speak, to correct, to reshape the moment into something safer, I simply held her gaze, steady and unyielding. And for the first time since she had entered my life, she was the one who hesitated. No one moved to interrupt me, and that told me more than anything else could have. Because silence like that does not come from confusion alone. It comes from recognition, from the subtle understanding that something important has just shifted and no one is quite sure how to respond without making it worse. And I let that silence remain exactly where it was, undisturbed. Because for the first time in a long while it was working in my favor, not against me. And I could see the unease beginning to ripple through the room in small, almost invisible ways, a guest adjusting their stance, another glancing toward the door, as if considering an early exit, the children drawing closer to their parents without quite knowing why. And through all of it, Lauren stood still, her composure holding but no longer effortless, no longer complete, because control requires certainty, and certainty had just slipped out of her grasp, even if she had not yet admitted it to herself. And Daniel finally stepped forward, just one step, tentative, as if testing whether he still understood the ground beneath him. And when he spoke my name, it sounded unfamiliar in his own voice, softer than before, edged with something I had not heard from him in years, hesitation. "Mom," he said, and I turned my head slightly toward him, not fully, just enough to acknowledge that he was there, because I had spent too many years turning fully, giving my attention completely, only to find it redirected somewhere else. And now I was learning the difference between acknowledging and yielding, between listening and surrendering. And he hesitated again, as if expecting me to fill the silence for him the way I always had, to smooth things over, to offer him a path back into comfort. But I did not. I simply waited. And in that waiting, something important became clear, not just to me, but to him as well, that I was no longer going to carry the weight of his decisions. And I saw it in the way his shoulders shifted, in the way his gaze flickered briefly toward Lauren before returning to me, searching, uncertain. And for a brief moment, I wondered if he remembered the man he used to be, the one who would have stepped forward without hesitation, who would have picked up the cane himself without needing to be told, who would have understood without explanation that dignity is not something you negotiate. But the thought passed quickly, because memory does not change the present, and the present was standing right in front of me, waiting for a response I was no longer willing to give in the way they expected. And Lauren's voice followed a second later, smooth again, practiced, as if she had found her footing once more. "I think we are all getting a little carried away," she said lightly, addressing the room rather than me, reframing the moment into something smaller, something manageable. But I noticed the way her eyes did not leave mine, the way she watched for any sign that I might step back into the role she had prepared. And when I did not, when I simply stood there, calm and unmoved, something in her expression tightened again, just briefly. Just enough to confirm what I already knew, that she was beginning to understand that this was not a moment she could reshape. And I rested my hand lightly on the back of the chair beside me, not for support, but as a quiet anchor, a reminder that I was exactly where I needed to be. And I let my gaze move across the room once more, taking in the details I had overlooked before, the careful placement of every object, the subtle signs of preparation that went beyond a simple celebration. And it became clearer then, not just what they had planned, but how long they had been planning it, the conversations I had not been part of, the decisions made in my absence, the quiet assumption that I would eventually agree, eventually comply, eventually disappear into the version of the future they had already constructed for me. And I felt no anger as that realization settled, only a steady clarity, because now that I could see it fully, there was no longer any question about what needed to happen next. And as Daniel opened his mouth again, perhaps to explain, perhaps to apologize, I lifted my hand slightly, not abruptly, just enough to stop him. And for a moment he froze, mid-word, and I held his gaze, calm and unwavering, because there are times when words only serve to soften the truth, and I had no interest in softening anything anymore. The moment I lifted my hand to stop him, something settled into place that could not be undone, not by explanation, not by apology, not even by regret. Because this was no longer about what had just happened in the room. It was about everything that had led to it, every quiet decision, every subtle shift, every time I had been guided rather than asked. And I could see now that they were waiting for me to speak, to define what this moment meant, to give it shape in a way they could respond to. But I had spent too many years explaining things for other people, softening the edges of uncomfortable truths so they could be easier to accept, and I was no longer interested in doing that. So instead I lowered my hand slowly and let the silence return, not empty this time, but full, deliberate, and I turned my attention back to the table, to the untouched cake, to the candles that had not yet been lit. And for a brief second I allowed myself to notice how carefully everything had been arranged, how intentional it all was, and that was when it became unmistakably clear that this evening had never been about celebration, not truly. It had been designed for something else entirely, something quieter, something easier to disguise as concern, and I thought again of the documents in Thomas Green's office, of the dates that aligned too neatly with recent conversations, of the language that framed control as care, and I realized that this moment here was not separate from that. It was part of the same pattern, the same slow effort to redefine my place without ever stating it directly. And once that realization settled fully, everything else became simpler, clearer, almost inevitable. And when I finally spoke again, my voice was calm, steady, carrying no anger and no hesitation. "I think it is time we stop pretending," I said, and the words moved through the room in a way that made people shift where they stood, not because they were loud, but because they were precise, and I turned my gaze to Daniel then, holding it long enough that he could not look away. "You have been making decisions about my life," I continued, without asking me. And there was no accusation in my tone, no raised voice, just a statement that left no room for misunderstanding, and I saw the immediate reaction in him, the way his posture changed, the way he opened his mouth as if to respond but found nothing ready to say, because this was not a conversation he had prepared for, not in this way, not with me standing here like this. And Lauren stepped in then, as I knew she would, her voice smooth again, controlled. "We have only been trying to help," she said, and there it was, the word again, help, always presented as something generous, something reasonable, something that could not easily be challenged without seeming ungrateful. But I did not look at her right away. I let her words settle in the air, let everyone hear them, let them recognize the pattern for themselves, and then I turned to her, slowly, meeting her gaze with the same calm I had held all evening. "Help does not require silence," I said, "and it does not require taking control away from someone who has not given it." And for the first time since I had known her, she did not immediately respond, because there are certain truths that do not leave much space to maneuver around them. And I could see the calculation behind her eyes, the quick search for a way to redirect, to soften, to regain the structure she preferred. But this was not a moment that could be redirected anymore, and Daniel spoke again, more quickly this time, as if trying to repair something before it slipped further. "Mom, we were just thinking about what is best for you," he said, and I felt something shift again, not inside me, but around me, because that phrase, "what is best for you," had been used so often that it had almost lost its meaning. And yet here it was again, offered as explanation, as justification, as if it could carry the weight of everything that had been done without question. And I held his gaze for a moment longer before answering, not with anger, not with disbelief, but with something far more difficult to dismiss. "What is best for me," I said quietly, "is still mine to decide." And I let that sentence rest exactly where it was, unembellished, complete, because sometimes the simplest truths are the ones that change everything. The words did not echo, but they stayed, settling into the room with a weight that could not be ignored, and I could feel the shift ripple outward again, quieter this time, deeper, as if something unspoken had finally been named, and no one quite knew how to move forward from it. And Daniel was the first to break, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the way his shoulders lowered just slightly, as if the certainty he had been holding onto had begun to loosen, and he glanced at Lauren again, not for direction this time, but for confirmation, and when he did not receive it immediately, when she remained still and silent for just a moment too long, something in his expression changed, something small but undeniable, doubt, and I watched it form, not with satisfaction, not with triumph, but with a kind of quiet acknowledgement, because doubt, once it begins, does not easily disappear. And Lauren, sensing the shift as clearly as I did, stepped forward again, her composure returning in careful layers, her voice smooth, measured. "No one is taking anything away from you," she said, and the phrasing was deliberate, chosen to sound reasonable, to sound calm. But I had learned to listen not just to the words, but to what they avoided, and I noticed that she did not say no one had tried, only that nothing had been taken yet, and that single distinction was enough. And I tilted my head slightly, considering her, giving her the space to continue if she wished, but she did not, and the silence that followed was different now, no longer waiting for me to respond, but waiting for something else to emerge, something neither of them had fully prepared for. And I took a slow breath, not out of necessity, but to mark the moment, to give it the shape it deserved. And then I spoke again, my voice even, steady. "You are right," I said, and I saw the brief flicker of relief in Daniel's eyes, the quick assumption that I was stepping back, that I was softening, that this would resolve in the familiar way it always had before. But I continued before that thought could take hold. "Nothing has been taken yet." And I let that word settle, yet, because it carried everything that needed to be understood without requiring explanation. And Lauren's expression shifted again, just slightly, her eyes narrowing in a way that suggested she recognized the direction this was moving, even if she did not yet know how to stop it. And I moved then, not away, not toward the door, but to the side of the table, where my handbag rested against the chair I had not yet sat in, and I reached for it with unhurried precision, my fingers closing around the handle as naturally as if I were preparing to leave at the end of an ordinary evening. And perhaps to anyone else in the room it looked like exactly that, a simple, unremarkable gesture. But I knew, and now they were beginning to understand that this was not about leaving, not in the way they expected. And Daniel took a step closer, his voice softer now, edged with uncertainty. "Mom, what are you doing?" he asked, and I glanced at him briefly, not dismissing him, but not offering comfort either, because there are moments when reassurance only delays the truth, and this was not one of those moments. And I opened my handbag slowly, deliberately, the soft sound of the clasp clicking open carrying through the room with a clarity that drew every eye back to me, and I reached inside, feeling the familiar edges of the envelope I had placed there earlier that afternoon. After leaving Thomas Green's office, after listening, after understanding, after deciding, and as my fingers closed around it, I felt that same steady clarity return, the same quiet certainty that had been building since the moment the phone had rung, and I withdrew the envelope carefully, holding it in both hands for a second before lifting my gaze again, not just to Lauren, not just to Daniel, but to the room as a whole, because this was no longer a private matter, not after what had been done, not after what had been revealed. And I realized then that this was the point where everything would change, not because of anger, not because of confrontation, but because truth, once brought into the open, does not return to where it came from. And as I met Lauren's eyes once more, steady and unflinching, I saw it clearly for the first time, not just calculation, not just control, but uncertainty, real and unguarded. And I understood then that whatever she had expected from me tonight, this was not it. I did not rush to open the envelope, and that was the first thing that unsettled them. Because urgency would have made sense. Urgency would have matched the tension in the room. But calm does something different. It stretches time. It forces people to sit inside their own thoughts. And I could see that happening now as I held it lightly in my hands, the weight of it far greater than the paper itself. And Daniel's gaze dropped to it, then lifted back to my face, searching again for something familiar. Something that would tell him this was still a moment he could understand, still a situation he could guide back into something manageable. But I offered him nothing except stillness, and Lauren, for all her control, took a small step closer, just enough to close the distance she had carefully maintained all evening, her voice lower now, more focused. "What is that?" she asked, and there was no softness in it anymore, no attempt to frame the moment as light or harmless. Because she understood now that this was not a performance she could direct, and I let her question linger for a second before answering, not out of hesitation, but out of intention, because timing matters, and I had learned that far too late in life. It is something I should have looked at sooner, I said, my voice even, steady, and I slipped my thumb beneath the edge of the envelope, opening it with slow precision, the sound of paper against paper carrying clearly through the quiet room, and I removed the documents inside, holding them carefully, not as evidence to be displayed, but as something already understood, already decided upon, and I glanced down at them briefly, not to read, but to confirm what I already knew, before lifting my gaze again. And this time I did not look at the room as a whole, I looked directly at Daniel, because some truths are meant to be heard by everyone, but understood by one person first. These are the updated filings, I said, and I saw the immediate reaction. The way his expression tightened, the way his breath caught just slightly, because he recognized the words even if he did not yet know how much I knew. And Lauren spoke again, more quickly now, her composure beginning to show the first real signs of strain. "We were going to talk to you about that," she said, and I almost smiled at the phrasing. Because it was so familiar, always just about to happen, always just waiting for the right time, a time that never quite arrived. And I shook my head slightly, not dismissively, but with quiet certainty. "You already did," I replied, "just not in a way you expected me to understand." And I let that settle before continuing, because this was not about overwhelming them. It was about clarity, precise and undeniable. "You filed for changes to my property access, my financial oversight, and future care arrangements," I said, and I did not raise my voice, did not accuse, did not dramatize. I simply stated what was there, and that was enough, because truth does not need volume to be heard. And Daniel's eyes widened slightly, not in shock, but in recognition, because now he understood that I was not guessing, not assuming, but knowing. And Lauren stepped forward again, her voice sharper now. "We were trying to protect you," she said, and there it was again, the justification, the framing, that had carried them this far, but something in it had changed, something less certain, less complete, and I held her gaze steadily, not challenging, not confrontational, just present. "From what?" I asked quietly, and for the first time, she did not have an immediate answer, and that was the moment everything shifted fully, because control depends on having the next line ready, the next explanation, the next step, and when that disappears, even for a second, the entire structure begins to falter, and I lowered the papers slightly, not hiding them, not displaying them, just holding them as they were, and I looked around the room once more, taking in the faces that now reflected something entirely different from before, no longer passive, no longer distant, but attentive, aware, and I realized that this was no longer just between the three of us, not after everything that had been said, not after everything that had been revealed, and I felt no need to raise my voice, no need to explain further, because the truth had already done its work. And as I returned my gaze to Lauren, I saw it clearly now, not just uncertainty, but something else beneath it, something she had not expected to feel tonight. And in that moment, I understood that whatever came next, it would not follow her plan anymore. No one spoke after that, and this time the silence was not uncertain. It was heavy, settled, as if the room itself had finally understood something that could not be undone. And I watched as Daniel's gaze moved from me to the papers in my hand and back again, his expression shifting through something slower now, something deeper than confusion, because this was no longer about a misunderstanding or a conversation that had gone too far. This was about intention, and intention is difficult to soften once it has been revealed. And Lauren stood very still, her composure no longer effortless, no longer complete, but held together carefully, as if she were choosing each breath, each movement, with deliberate control. And I realized then that there was nothing more I needed to prove, nothing more I needed to explain, because everything that mattered had already been said, not in raised voices or dramatic gestures, but in the quiet clarity of facts that could not be reshaped once spoken aloud. And I lowered the documents slightly, letting them rest against my side, not as a threat, not as a display, but simply as something that now existed in the open. And I took a small step back from the table, creating space, not distance, just enough to mark the end of something that had been unfolding for far too long. And Daniel finally spoke again, his voice softer than I had ever heard it, stripped of certainty, stripped of direction. "Mom," "We did not mean for it to feel like this," he said, and I looked at him for a long moment, not searching, not questioning, just seeing him as he was. And I understood then that meaning and outcome are not the same, that intention does not erase impact, and I did not need to argue that point, because the truth of it was already standing between us, visible and undeniable. And I shook my head slightly, not in anger, not in dismissal, but in quiet acknowledgement. "It already does," I said, and I let that be enough, because sometimes the simplest answer is the only one that matters. And Lauren opened her mouth as if to speak again, to reclaim, to redirect, but whatever she intended to say did not come, because there are moments when even the most carefully chosen words cannot rebuild what has been exposed. And I turned then, not abruptly, not dramatically, just a natural movement, as if I were stepping out of a room that had grown too quiet to remain in, and I reached for my coat draped over the back of the chair, lifting it with steady hands, the fabric familiar, grounding, and I slipped it over my shoulders without haste, aware of every eye still on me, aware of the shift that had taken place, not just in the room, but in something far more permanent. And I picked up my cane again, this time not as something that had been taken from me, but as something that had always been mine, something I chose to use, not something that defined me. And I moved toward the door at an unhurried pace, each step measured, deliberate, and no one moved to stop me. Not Daniel, not Lauren, not anyone else, because they understood, even if they did not yet fully accept it, that this was not an exit they could control, not a decision they could redirect. And when I reached the doorway, I paused for just a second, not out of hesitation, but to allow the moment to settle fully into what it had become, and I turned my head slightly, just enough to let my voice carry back into the room one final time, calm, steady, and certain. "You asked me to crawl," I said, and I let that sentence stand on its own for a brief moment before finishing. "But I remember exactly how to walk." And with that, I stepped forward, leaving the room behind, not as someone who had been pushed out, but as someone who had chosen to leave on her own terms. And for the first time in a very long while, the path ahead felt entirely mine. An elderly mother thought her birthday would be a quiet moment of family connection. But what unfolded revealed the hidden truth behind years of manipulation and control within her own home. When her daughter-in-law crosses a line that exposes the fragile balance of power, the elderly woman responds not with anger, but with calm clarity that shifts everything. This emotionally driven narrative explores dignity, control, and the silent strength of a mother who refuses to be diminished, making it one of the most powerful family stories about respect, independence, and truth. As tensions rise and carefully hidden intentions come to light, the confrontation between the elderly mother and the daughter-in-law reveals a deeper pattern of influence and quiet decisions made without consent, reflecting the reality behind many family stories where love and control become dangerously intertwined. Through subtle dialogue, restrained emotion, and a steady unraveling of trust, this story captures the moment when silence turns into awareness and awareness becomes action, positioning it among unforgettable family stories that highlight resilience and self-worth. The elderly mother's journey from quiet observation to decisive action is a compelling reminder that strength does not always appear loud, and that even in the most controlled environments, truth can surface and redefine everything, making this one of the most engaging family stories for viewers seeking emotional depth and realism. As the narrative unfolds, each moment builds toward a powerful realization that dignity cannot be negotiated, and that even long-standing dynamics can change in an instant when clarity replaces doubt, solidifying its place among impactful family stories that resonate across generations. This story delivers a deeply satisfying emotional payoff through a calm, yet unshakable response, proving that true power lies in knowing when to stand still and when to walk away, leaving behind a lasting impression as one of the most memorable family stories centered on family betrayal and personal strength. Character 1 is an 81-year-old white American woman with silver hair standing upright wearing an elegant navy dress and holding a wooden cane. Front view portrait. Realistic lighting. No cartoon, no CGI. No illustration. Natural aging skin texture. Character 2 is a 38-year-old white American woman with blonde hair styled neatly, wearing a modern, elegant outfit and subtle makeup. Front view portrait. Realistic lighting. No cartoon, no cartoon. No CGI. No illustration. Confident expression, sharp eyes.